This month's Where Did the Road Go is brought to you by three amazing people, Super Inframan, Allison Cook, and 36 Dingo. If you want to become a patron or a sponsor, go to wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am here with Christopher Ernst.
Hey there.
Taylor Bell.
Hey.
Octavian Graves.
Hello.
And Ian Burton.
Hello.
Who this time does not sound like he's talking on a cell phone, because he's not.
Yeah. That's true.
I mean, if you are talking on a cell phone, that's pretty impressive, actually.
Got one of those newfangled space cell phones.
This is exactly the same group as it was last time, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
It might be.
I think it's going to be a related, pseudo-related conversation, too, I think. So
we shall see. We're going to talk about Graham Hancock's new, is it 8 parts?
Yeah.
Yep.
Series on Netflix, which is called Ancient Apocalypse, and particularly about some of the criticisms of it. So the thing with me and Graham is that I might not be doing this show if it wasn't for Graham Hancock.
right.
Short version of that is I hated talk radio. Got into Graham because I saw the end of probably the last time he had any kind of series out, which was like in the early 2000s for the Underworld stuff. And I would leave my TV on like History or Discover or whatever channel it was and like be doing other stuff, listening to music, but I'd have the subtitles on. And it popped up about the pyramids being aligned to Orion. And I was like, wait, what? What's this? And turned it on. I'm like, who is this guy? Who's Graham Hancock? And got to see the third part of that. I caught it at the end of the second part, got to see the third part. Went to a New Age bookstore. I had no idea he was a bestseller. So I figured I'm going to have to go to an obscure bookstore to find any of his stuff. All they had was Heaven's Mirror, which is a beautiful book. His wife did all the photography for it. It's a large-sized book with tons of photos, and it just goes around the world showing how all these ancient monuments are aligned to zodiac alignments and such, and solstice and stuff like that. So that was my first exposure to Graham, and then at some point I was following him on whatever, I don't know if it was MySpace or what, but he put up a torrent with all his coast-to-coast appearances on it. And I had hated talk radio, but I'm like, or no, I guess first he announced he was going to be on Coast to Coast. And I said, but I don't like talk radio, but I want to hear Graham. And I was all, I don't know what to do. And finally I said, fine, I'll find a station. I tuned it in, listened to the whole thing, couldn't get enough of listening to him. So then he put up that torrent and I kind of savored them for a while and then went, well, there's Coast to Coast. Are there other shows like this that he's on? And so I found like Red Ice Radio when it was doing stuff like this rather than the extreme right-wing politics they do now, if they're still a thing, and a few other shows, and then started expanding like who else are on these shows. And the next thing I know, I'm listening to podcasts all the time. And at some point I was listening to a very bad podcast, and I'm like, well, why does this person get to talk to these people when they don't even know what they're talking about and they're not paying attention to their guests? I want to talk to these people. So when I started Where Did the Road Go, I said, if I get to talk to Graham Hancock, Andrew Collins, and Robert Schoch, even if everyone hates the show, I'll be happy. That was my criteria for success right there. And I've never had Graham on, but I have talked to him. We did the John Anthony West telethon trying to raise money for John before he died. So I got to talk to him a little bit. He did say he would come on the show and that I should contact him when the new book came out, which was 2 books ago. And he gave me his direct email, and I never messaged him. I may do so now that this documentary is out, because I'm sure he could use some positive publicity. But he's also very busy, so I don't know. And, of course, I've had Randall Carlson on numerous times on this show, long before he was connected with Graham. But if it wasn't for Graham Hancock, I don't know that I would be doing this.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
That's totally fair.
He definitely has a special place in my world. Not that I agree with him on everything, but I think he's more or less on the right track with stuff.
Yeah,
sure. I think that he's the important thing I feel at least about Graham Hancock's work, and I know that there are a lot of people that really dislike him and feel that he's for the most part, I think exploiting native civilizations, espousing white supremacy, all this other stuff that we can get into.
Nonsense.
But you have to read his books in order to talk about what because a lot of the ways in which I think he expresses himself in, the series that we're discussing, or even, on certain, podcasts and stuff like that he goes on, like Rogan, which I don't think necessarily by association he's doing himself any favors. Say what you want about Rogan, but I don't think so, because Rogan has some pretty terrible ideas on there, along with some really good ones. And but I really do think you have to read the books. And so anybody that's giving critiques of him, I think that you can't until you actually read the books. Even if you feel like there's something that's coming through, from this new series or anything like that, I really encourage people to read the books before they come to a final conclusion.
Agreed. There are a lot of books. We were trying to figure this out. I didn't look it up. Off the top of my head, there's at least 8 books.
And the one specifically, I think, that Ancient Apocalypse deals with, one of the more recent ones, which is it? I'm going to confuse it with Whitley Strieber's newest book. It's not A New World. That's Whitley Strieber's.
No.
It's what's it called? Time something before?
America Before.
America Before.
That's
right? Yeah. That was the last one that I read. Fingerprints of the Gods, which is his first book, or his first book on this subject, and then the other one, The Magicians of the Gods, and what else?
So I've got his website pulled up.
He has the Sign and the Seal, which
Sign and the Seal,
his book about looking for the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which was his first foray into this type of stuff, like the unexplained type of stuff, and he tracked it to Ethiopia and had some pretty good evidence that it could be in Ethiopia.
There is some, yes.
Yeah. So,
isn't like the world's oldest Bible in Ethiopia? Ethiopia?
I believe so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and I think they were also one of the only ones that had certain books of the Bible preserved.
Yes.
So
he has 23 books listed on his website.
23? Well, he did write some stuff prior to getting into this.
He's a journalist,
Yeah, he's a journalist.
Some of them are quite different, but a lot of them seem to be dealing with
fiction on there too.
Oh yeah, and he has all his fiction. That's true. He has at least
fiction,
six or 8 books that are fiction.
Okay.
Because he got tired of being attacked every time he wrote anything.
Yeah.
So he decided to kind of take it easy and write some fiction, but of course all his fans are like, but we don't want fiction from you.
Oh yeah, I see here the Master Game, War God.
Yeah.
Those seem to be I don't know about the Master Game, but War God definitely looks like a novel.
Yeah, there's I think 2 trilogies or something like that.
Okay.
But he did the Sign of the Seal. They did Fingerprints of the Gods, which became a bestseller, and that's where he started getting attacked from the archaeological community.
Yep.
And after that, there was Heaven's Mirror, which I already mentioned. There's a book on Mars, which is I can't remember what it's called.
That's the one I've never read.
The Mars Mystery.
Yeah.
That's it. So he deals with the structures on Mars, but more importantly, he deals with the problem of near-Earth objects potentially colliding with Earth. So most of that book is talking about the danger of asteroids and comets and stuff, and how little we know about the area around our planet and around our solar system that could endanger us.
He goes into a good bit of that. I mean, that's more or less what the show is about. It kind of leads up to that idea.
Right, and that's where he started, is in that Mars book. So
okay.
Then there's Underworld, which is him diving on these ancient sites that would have been above water during the last ice age. And the funny thing is, some of those sites at the time, he was again attacked for bringing this stuff out, and now they're acknowledged. But he's still not acknowledged for being the one who said, hey, these sites are here.
Yeah.
And then there was Supernatural, which is where he started getting into the hallucinogens and showing the connections between the cave art, shamanistic stuff, ayahuasca, the UFO phenomena, all that stuff. It's a fantastic book, but all of his books are dense because he goes through great pains to show you where he's coming up with every single bit of data. They are extensively footnoted. And I mean, and that's another reason he wanted to do the fiction, is he just wanted to write without having to back everything up tenfold.
Right.
And still get criticized for it.
Right.
And then and then the 2 newer books there, America Before and Morning of the Magicians. Was that the other one?
Magicians of the Gods.
Yeah,
and then
Magicians
there's also
of the Gods. Morning of the
Visionary.
Visionary, yeah.
Okay.
That looks
Morning of the Magicians is another. It's a whole other show.
Oh.
So, yeah, he has a lot. He's a very proficient writer. It's funny because he was stoned most of the time.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, he
was.
As he put it, he abused pot and was just literally stoned nonstop and was afraid not to be. And after our ayahuasca trip, it basically said to him, stop doing it. So he did and found out he could write 10 times as fast, not stoned. Yeah. And one of the things,
I think that a lot of the sort of stigma that at least in mainstream media comes with the fact that he's talking about ayahuasca, UFOs, and, cave paintings, and that people just, nobody can go there.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because I think that, I admire the fact that, and I know this is a criticism that some people have of him, is that he tries to sort of like glom all of these books and his theories together into one super theory. But I think he's doing, he's looking at these threads and connections, and he's finding where they do connect. And I think that there's some real, there is something that comes out of this that is positive when you just explore these ideas, which is all he's really asking.
Yeah. And again, he never states that he's a scientist or anything like that. He very rightfully calls himself a journalist. And he states that right at the beginning of Ancient Apocalypse. He's, and this is available on Netflix for anyone who's not aware. But right at the beginning, he states very clearly he is a journalist. He's just exploring this stuff. And
he talks about how people refer to him as a pseudoscientist or even a pseudo-archaeologist.
Yeah.
The first thing that comes up on Wikipedia is that he's a pseudo-archaeologist or pseudoscientist or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, and he's had literal documentaries done that were basically character assassinations on him. Now, if you look at Robert Schoch, and Robert's the one that redated the age of the Sphinx using geological data, hard evidence. And, he told me, and I can't remember if he said it on the show when he was on or not, but he flat out said that archaeologists, Egyptologists in particular, spit on him for this information, for bringing this stuff to light.
But it threatens their worldview, and it threatens their sort of established narrative of what happened, which is it's really ironic, and I'm sure this will come up again, that basically flies in the face of everything that science is actually trying to do.
I was going to ask, for the people who aren't aware, can we talk about what the archaeologists' theories are and what they are opposed to with Graham?
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
Maybe people are going to hear him talk about how archaeologists are, throwing him under the bus and trying to bury him, but they may not know what the archaeologists' points are.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that too, and to seeing what is causing. What do you guys think is the visceral negativity, as opposed to just a disagreement, saying, "Hey, I don't agree with you," but that visceral, venomous, almost campaign.
So Graham's idea, from looking at evidence, is that at one point there was an advanced civilization on this planet. Now, when he says advanced, and in the series he's very clear, he's not talking something like what we have with electronics and planes and stuff like that, but at least a world...
advanced to a hunter-gatherer society.
Well, beyond hunter-gatherer, to the point where they can build these large structures across the world and had advanced astronomical, mathematical knowledge, advanced in a different way than we are.
Correct.
And that at the end of the Ice Age, there was a cataclysm, and this destroyed most of their civilization. And we have just a few remnants left. And it seems like there were these civilizers who went around early in our history and taught these things, these mathematics and astronomy and stuff like that, to some of these early cultures and sort of civilized them. And what archaeologists don't like is that archaeologists are very Darwinian in this culture. There's no cataclysms, except for maybe the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. And everything progresses from lesser to more.
And their other idea is uniformitarianism, which basically, and Graham explains this in the show too, but the concept that change happens over time very slowly.
Right.
So everything's gradual. So I think specifically he talks about it in reference to the Scablands, and the prevailing theory with that is that lots and lots of water over a very long period of time caused these changes.
Right.
And basically what Graham and Randall are positing is that it probably was a huge, enormous amount of water very, very quickly.
Right.
And within that water were, it wasn't just water too. It was, giant icebergs that were, the size of semi-trailers full of rocks and stuff like that. It's
Right.
this incredibly destructive, catastrophic, sudden event, like over a couple of weeks.
Right. And there's probably things like tsunamis and all the things that come, because that can affect weather as well.
Well, yeah.
His
that's
ultimate
good.
theory being that it was, the Perseid, or is it the Perseid or the
Perseid.
the one that we're in right now, meteor shower.
Oh, wait,
that
is
it
that
was.
the Torrid meteor shower? Or meteor
What are we in right now?
I think
one or
we're
the
in
other.
Torrid, but I'm not
Torrid. Okay, the Torrid meteor shower. Right now, I'm sorry, I'm confusing those two.
Yeah,
but
that's
whichever
common.
one that's coming up again right now.
I thought it was the Perseid that he was looking at, but it could be the Torrid.
And that it was not just, one big strike. It was a bunch of smaller but still large strikes all around the northern hemisphere, this certain area of the northern hemisphere.
And
Yeah.
has there been I guess we'll call them official archaeologists that have looked into his theories and come up with either evidential counterpoints or agreeing with him?
Evidential counterpoints? No.
I think it's
They
important
just
also,
cite no evidence.
we should point out that it's not just Graham that has these ideas and is exploring these things. There are actual, archaeologists and geologists and multidisciplinary people who are doing science to try to understand this stuff. And there have been papers published about things like the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis.
Yep.
And what, you asked about quote unquote official scientists, right? People that are supported by the mainstream. As far as I know, with one paper in particular, they basically had discovered that there were, I think it was essentially microdiamonds and other evidence of some kind of massive impact event at a certain location. I don't remember the location off the top of my head, but
It's in
this
Southwest,
was,
I believe, right?
I'm not sure.
You're not talking about the site that he visited from in the series, are you?
The Scablands?
No, not the Scablands. You're not talking about the black
The black mat. I don't know specifically. This is stuff I've heard in Cosmographia, which is actually, y'all are probably familiar with that podcast, but the Snake Brothers.
Snake Brothers and Randall Carlson. Very, very good podcast for this stuff.
And so this paper was published demonstrating what they had found and why it was possibly caused by some kind of an impact. And another group of quote unquote scientists came out and tried to recreate the study, but basically botched it. And then, published a paper saying that they didn't find the same stuff. And that was carried in the news media essentially as experts disprove Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And so a third group came by and did an independent study on the exact same materials and actually followed the original methods and did find the same things as the original paper. I think that paper is called is it called the Firebrand paper?
It's something like that. Yeah. I'm glad you pointed this out. Yeah. I totally forgot about this. Yep.
And that has nothing to do with Graham. That's two scientists who, I can't remember their names, but they did that a long time ago. That was probably 20 years ago.
Yep. Yeah, something. And so the point is there's a lot of people, or there are at least some people doing these kinds of explorations, and Graham is definitely a part of that. And is, as he says, right, a journalist. He's taking these concepts and this information and putting it into a digestible format for people to grapple with these ideas and try to understand what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of ways he's sort of collating this data for people.
Yeah, and that's it. Regardless of how we feel about his hypotheses, and if that, his specific ideas are actually what happened, what can't be ignored is that all these things do exist. Like there are many mysteries and anomalies all across the planet that do have interconnected patterns, and they exist, whatever the truth of it is, or, if it's one scientist or another giving them, that's interesting. And I think he has a point to say that they deserve to be looked at.
Yes.
And that's something I want to talk about is, going against the mainstream obviously has a lot of pushback, with a lot of venom towards him. But, as you said earlier, the idea of science, there's a mystery, there's something there. It is warranted to be investigated. Whether we put a capstone and say we solved it or not, which I think can be a problem. But, I think that's what from where I am in his show and his work altogether and people like him. That's where I'm at. Like, these things do exist. They are real. And some of them are anomalous in terms of what archaeologists have come up with as an explanation of our history.
Yeah.
It's right. You've talked about this before. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a scientist that was kind of presenting these kind of radical ideas, and they successfully buried him in his career. And then all of a sudden they realized that he was right about everything.
That's a lot of people over the years.
Yeah, but there was one specifically. But yeah, like
the guy who came up with the tectonic plate theory was blackballed and buried, only to be, have his theory reappear 20 years later and be accepted.
Yeah, so this is like a trend within academia.
Yes.
And it's very disturbing, honestly, that the people that we trust as the people who know things, these experts, and there's no I'm not against experts, the idea of experts, but that the people who are running the show as far as our history are so willing to just throw away these ideas just because
I think that's something that is important to bring up, and Graham brings this up too a lot, this idea of you don't trust experts, find out for yourself. And I think that there is a lot of truth in that, but I think at the same time you also have to understand that there are people that have, what you're talking about is more the problem of money, power, and human greed and hubris. And that,
Absolutely.
There are many experts out there, and they're probably the ones you don't know about because they're not in positions of power and authority, because, being honest is not rewarded these days. And so the bigger problem being that we don't have the right experts that we're listening to. And, I strongly believe that. So I really want to make sure, at least on my part, that, I encourage people, yes, do your own research, but you should be looking to the experts that are really telling the truth. And it's going to be hard to find them. Especially with the internet, there is, and I know I'm going to sound like an old man, but there is so much disinformation out there. You have no idea. And you probably are thinking some things are true that aren't, and me included. So it's really important to be able to the most important thing is being able to find multiple sources, figure out and extrapolate from that where you should be looking and what's going on. Definitely don't trust one source. And if it all sounds the same, you certainly should be looking at more and finding, alternative arguments. It really, absolutely. I guess I get when I hear Graham talk about don't trust the experts, and I know where he's coming from, but he's been burned so bad. He's he's got a chip on his shoulder, I think, that is kind of blinding him to, how reactionary he might be.
It certainly is influencing, his state of mind and how he's producing things. And it could be stated that it's fair. But you're right about the media and just, the internet and how it's just a deluge of kind of a shallow soup. A lot of it has monetized incentives. And, I always tell people is read those articles that cite sources. I kind of take tongue in cheek any buzz articles in general, but especially ones that don't highlight a book or an article, just so you should be able to follow those tracks, those sourced material to an actual book or a scientific article or, to a paper where people are saying exactly where they've gotten this information. Because if they've made it up, it'll be clear because it won't go anywhere. Or you'll see it. If you do the work, you'll see where it's coming from. It just takes time.
The people presenting the ideas just as much as you research the ideas that they're presenting.
I think ideas should speak for themselves, but the people who follow them and come up with them and research them always color them a little bit. Sometimes, everybody's going to. But, sometimes it's in a more negative way than necessary. And it's good to kind of be aware of that by looking and following the trail of crumbs that they left.
And the problem with archaeology is the same as anything else. I mean, it is done by people, and people have their opinions, their beliefs, and their biases. And a lot of times those are unconscious biases.
And if you spend, and I think Graham has said this, if you spend 12 years of your life, studying for something, it's gonna become part of your identity. And if somebody is attacking that, something very specifically that you have been taught and based your entire career on, which is also based on your financial stability and your identity, you're going to get defensive, even if they're making sense. You know, if somebody were to come for film, I mean, I don't know how I could be threatened because what I do, what I'm an expert in is so nebulous or so practical. Like, you know, like I'm not threatened by the, you know, digital cinema, you know, or anything like that.
Right.
But it's, you know, if that were to happen or something, you know, to threaten my identity as a film professor, I'm sure that I would react in a defensive way because I'm an imperfect human, you know. So I understand that. But it's, you know, when you have the entire chorus of your peers feeling the same way, you become a mob.
Oh, yeah. And it's like a lot of the mainstream community, obviously not all of them. But it does kind of smell like that same very human kind of high school attitude, or once somebody has been selected to kind of be that scapegoat, that just, it becomes so easy for other people to color their opinions of everything about that person, regardless of the merit or legitimacy of their work. The human brain will sometimes just say, you know, they'll read something that's filled with perfectly fine evidence, and it'll just skim it and say, well, that guy's nuts. So, you know, and you have to wonder how many people who are authorities follow that human behavior unconsciously.
When I was in high school, I used to, you know, I was the decked out metal guy. I used to wear my battle jacket every day. I had the most extreme band shirts. And then there was this kid that came in and he would wear like Slipknot or like Black Veil Brides, like, which is the most, it's not even metal really. It's like the most surface level stuff. And kids started calling him the metal kid. He was the metal kid of high school. And that used to drive me nuts because like, wait a minute. No, hold on. I'm like, do you see what I'm wearing here? And so unrelated, but I get it. Like I understand.
Meanwhile, the guy working in metallurgy class who just came up with something amazing and everybody ignores him. He's like, but I'm the metal kid.
Yeah, exactly. Guys. But like, I can kind of understand it from that perspective of when you like are very invested in something and then someone that you see coming in from a very surface level and then getting all that attention and then they become the authority when they haven't done the work. I can understand it from that perspective. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what do you guys think are some of Graham's most compelling theories based on the evidence, circumstantial or otherwise, that he's presenting? What do you guys think, I think in your minds?
I think the fact that we know, and it's accepted science, I mean, as far as we know anything, that during the last ice age, the sea levels were 300 to 400 feet lower.
Yeah.
Which means, since we see through history, through mankind, we always build along the shore. So if you have, you know, a civilization during the last ice age, they're going to build on areas that are now deep underwater. And
he starts that off right in the beginning.
Yeah, and he has dove on sites and found sites underwater. Again, some of these weren't acknowledged at the time, but were later. And then when the tsunami hit, because he doesn't discount ancient knowledge. So if a culture says, like I think in that case it was a Brahmin temple or something, that there were 9 of them, the current one was the 9th, the others were all swallowed by the ocean, and archaeologists said that's nonsense, and that tsunami came through and uncovered a couple of temples.
Right, and I see that logic. It's like, well, you're, you know, this established history that, you know, there's, you know, this temple, and the rest of the history says, well, hey, there were 8 more. They just got flooded. And then you have archaeologists saying, well, that's not right. I can see his logic is saying, but why are you saying that's not there? Like, we haven't looked.
Right. And because of that one fluke tsunami, it unburied those things. And they were like, oh, look, another temple. It's like, you mean just like they said was there?
And part of it, too, with things that are buried, especially in the oceans, is that it's not just water that's on top of these things, right? And there's also sediment, and you know, rocks can get shifted around and stuff like that.
Sure,
I was thinking that too. Like, I think people don't have a good, I'd say a lot of people who aren't in, you know, the specific fields, I don't think they have a good idea of how difficult it can be to, you know, map the underlayers of the ocean floor. Like, the ocean is absolutely massive, and it's not easy just to, you know, look at it and say, well, we just examine this like 20-mile track of ocean floor. Like, it's not that easy to do. Like, there's a reason they're still pulling runes out in the past few years that aren't even that far from populated areas that they didn't even know about.
And that's the thing.
I think they just did that near Egypt a couple months ago. I can't recall what it was, but I saw an article that they had pulled another, like a tomb out, you know, just in the Mediterranean outside of Egypt or in the Nile Valley that they, you know, hadn't heard of before. But.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The and the thing is, water destroys too. I mean, a lot of that stuff just isn't there to find anymore.
Which is why Göbekli Tepe is so interesting, because they buried it above ground, and that helped protect it from the water and everything else.
There's one of the Lost Cities books from David Hatcher Childress. Now, Childress is not like Graham. Childress just throws out random ideas here and there, but he has traveled the world looking at these ancient ruins. And one of his stories that really stuck with me is that he was in South America or Mexico, Central America, somewhere, and he's in this museum and he's looking at this stuff and he's like, this stuff looks exactly like the stuff in ancient China. And so he said something to one of the archaeologists that was there, and they said, well, there's no connection. And then he's like, but how can you say there's no connection? They look exactly the same. Like the designs are the same, the techniques are the same. And I guess she said to him something like, I don't study China, so there's no connection. Or something like that, just dismissive because that's not her field.
Wow. If you see there are a couple photos out there that exist there of painted Mesoamerican ruins, and they look surprisingly like certain, early Chinese dynasty buildings. It's really kind of interesting.
Yeah, and there is a set paradigm that these cultures had no contact. Period. End of question. So if you suggest, well, they look the same, and it's like, well, that's just coincidence then,
You have to wonder too, like how many are, like the scientists you just talked about, that because a lot of these professionals, their careers depend on their how legitimate they appear, the quality of their work, the consistency they're putting it out. And, a lot of them are very focused on what they know, which isn't a bad thing. But, people suggest, well, this is a famous archaeologist. They know everything about every ancient culture, which isn't always the case.
Right.
How many of them are kind of on that level where they don't want to look like they don't know something. So because it's not in their wheelhouse, they just say, well, that doesn't exist. You just have to wonder how common that is, which is obviously can be very hurtful to, the accurate study of our history.
I think there's also a level that with Graham's notoriety these days and how it's built up over time, if an archaeologist came out in agreement with him at this point, it would probably be career suicide for him just because of how hated Graham is.
Yeah. And I think that, again, I really do think it's unfortunate that Graham has put I wish he hadn't included Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson in there, who, I think Jordan Peterson, garbage ideas.
Was he
in general? Huh?
Was Jordan Peterson in the show?
Very briefly, in one of the montages, and a lot of Joe Rogan. And I don't think Joe Rogan is as evil as everybody thinks he is. I think he's just kind of a moron, honestly. He has some very interesting people on his show, and then he has some people with some really destructive, terrible ideas on his show. And he treats, even though I know he does take some people to task, not very hard, and he treats a lot of people equally. So with the loud mouthpiece that he has, I do think it's kind of destructive. That being said, Graham doesn't have anywhere else to go, and all these other great people that Rogan's talking to, Paul Stamets, Randall Carlson, on and on and on. I understand why he's doing it. I just think it's going to shoot him, and he's really he's burned his bridge. There's no way he's ever going to, and I don't think he needs to.
No.
But it is going to. I do think it damages. If he wants to have legitimacy, it's tough. It's going to be tough.
You got to imagine that probably beyond that.
Right. He's probably running for the nearest exit sign he can. And that exit sign is people who will take him seriously. So whether it's Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, I don't think he's counting their ideas or how they stand in the community. They're just saying oh, okay, this person is listening to me. They're taking me seriously. Let me just, talk to them because I'm not going to get my head bashed in.
And he probably could be a little bit more aware of his surroundings. But that has nothing to do with his. That has nothing to do with his ideas. I think it's separate from his ideas.
I think Joe Rogan. I mean, say what you say about Joe Rogan. I think he's still #1 podcast in the country.
Probably.
Well,
I believe because
there are a lot of really popular things that are terrible and terrible out there.
We're not going to even say. I mean, about Joe Rogan does. Well, it's already been said. He has terrible viewpoints on his show, but probably from Graham's point of view. If he's everything he does, no matter how legitimate or not legitimate those ideas are, he's already got, a tsunami in his face. He's never going to be able to push the good ideas he has forward, at least maybe in his mind, because the mainstream scientific establishment has already discounted him. So there's nothing he can really do. Because again, we've mentioned it, that some of his ideas were legitimate and then were later adopted, and he was given no credit.
Yes.
So he might be in that same, well, Joe Rogan's one of the most popular speakers, mouthpieces that can get my word out there for better or for worse. So I don't think he's going for mainstream acceptability, but more maybe that more people will hear me, more people will, digest, look into my books, maybe even just help him financially, that maybe he will have that if enough people get on that tide of saying, hey, this guy's onto something. Then that might be, because the only way you can force the mainstream establishment to really move when it's a social construct, when it's not entirely based on just strict evidence, which honestly some of the mainstream community is like that, being people. The only way they can really move that is massive public push where they kind of have to step back and say,
but they don't.
All right.
And I don't want
They
to
usually don't.
Joe Rogan, but like for me, I found Graham Hancock, I found Randall Carlson, I found Terrence and Dennis McKenna, I found Paul Stamets, all through Joe Rogan. So like, I'm not a fan of Joe Rogan anymore, but there was a point where I was introduced to a lot of new ideas that have very, impacted me and shown me a lot of things that I may have never seen, other than that. So I think for me, that's the only reason I bring him up at all, is because without him, I may not have ever found these guys.
I liked Joe Rogan on News Radio.
I was just about to say that.
Oh man, yeah.
I have listened.
I liked his stand up back in the day when I was a teenager.
He does stand up. I think he's a terrible comedian.
He is.
He is a terrible. He was funny on News Radio. He was funny as hell on News Radio.
Yes, everyone was funny as hell on News Radio. But
such a good show. Yeah.
I've only listened to a handful of his shows, and it's usually when it has a guest on that I actually I'm interested in, like Graham.
Yep.
Or
the Bob Lazar stuff.
Yeah,
of course.
The Bob Lazar stuff. Not because I was interested in Bob Lazar,
right.
but
you got to listen to it.
Yeah.
Like this underground thing is now on kind of a big thing. So we're gonna listen.
But didn't Joe have Graham on with Michael Shermer and Randall Carlson?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a great episode.
Yeah,
that one was pretty interesting.
Good.
And the mainstream is never going to accept anything Graham's saying. Not now. Because again, going back to Robert Schoch, here's Robert Schoch, who's a Boston geologist. This is a scientist who is presenting hard geological evidence that the Sphinx is much older than Egyptologists think it is, based on the erosion patterns and based on the climate data. Yep. And they will not accept it.
Nope.
Every geologist who has looked at it has agreed wholeheartedly with Schoch, but Egyptologists will not change the dating of the Sphinx because it screws everything up for them.
And that's the glaring absurdity of that, mainstream scientific, because it's almost its own body. You have specific people, even when tons of people are agreeing by actually looking at the evidence. And, I know you guys are familiar and probably fans of John Keel, but, I got to bring him up because he had a very similar later in life kind of cynicism against the scientific establishment for a lot of the same reasons as Graham Hancock. Where if you read
you become so convinced. I mean, when you're doing anything like this, you tend to get wrapped up in your own ideology, and the things you're finding, often just reinforce those things, and you get beaten down by people telling you you're wrong, or just not even paying attention, or bad mouthing you publicly.
It's just that you do all this work, and you get no recognition, and that has to be infuriating. I brought up Keel because he named, teasing the scientists, I think it was in either Haunted Planet or his Guide to Mysterious Beings, he names them Type A and Type B scientists. And he kind of calls them out, how a lot of the people who are getting on, the soapboxes, discounting a lot of these, weirder theories, are what he calls Type A scientists. And they are scientists who kind of, they're publishing research papers, to the community, but they really, that's all they do.
Yes.
And they have to kind of keep their head up, and they have to look good in the establishment because that's how they make a paycheck.
For the reputation.
But they don't get their hands dirty. Like they sit in a university and they kind of just repeat the same theories over and over and say, oh, this is right. Where the Type B scientists are rarely even in the peer, conferences, because they're out in the world doing work. And, they have science. Their hands there, and they're doing science. And usually, they get, approached they're like, yeah, I don't have time for that. I don't care.
Right.
Like, I'm just doing my work. But
It should
the
be.
type A scientists, when somebody calls, a university to say, hey, we're not experts on this particular thing. Can you give us a scientific opinion? You get the type A scientist who, they'll just say whatever they think about it and say, well, I'm a scientist. So you kind of have to, for this reason, you have to do it. And he kind of just teases that so many of these theories were never even really investigated at all.
Yeah.
We just assumed they were because some type A scientist just laughed it off. And then later on, a few years later, and this has happened a lot in the last century, where it's reapproached and seen, oh no, that's a very valid idea. And then they dig into it and they realize it's true. And then now the new generation of type A scientists are like, oh, we had that idea all the time.
Well, and it's really important also to remember that we don't know. When it comes down to science, especially, we don't have the answers to what things are. What science is for and what it does is help determine what something is not.
Yes.
And when you make assumptions or, you quote unquote figure something out about the world or about, human history or archaeology or anything, and it becomes sort of the established truth, science is the job of science is to come along and break that down in order to help it become something new. And then it has to happen again and again and again. That's the only way we improve.
Science is a method, and it's
exactly.
people forget that it's about you repeatedly fail to disprove. It's not that you ever prove anything. No, very seldom, very infinitesimal, comparatively are the times when something is actually proven. What happens is that things are repeatedly it's falsification. You repeatedly you cannot disprove it, and that's when something becomes a theory rather than a hypothesis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's really the way that people should be looking at it. But again, science, and even that term has become it's become a belief system.
Yes,
so
exactly.
it's something that's different.
a verb.
I
feel like science should be a verb. You're, like it's something that you do. It's not something that you are.
Absolutely. And it's a frame of mind. And I think people think, well, a scientist is like this specific, person on this pinnacle in a lab. And it's not entirely true. Like, it's science, as you said, science is a method. It's a way of thinking and looking at the world and approaching things with that method. And that can run a spectrum of, from the amateur to the guy in the field who's a lifetime of work and experience. It is indeed a method. And if you shift into belief and justification of personal ideals over that method, you're no longer acting like a scientist.
You also have the concept, and I believe Graham's mentioned it before, the one coffin at a time progress in science, where, newer people coming in are more open to new ideas, but those ideas aren't going to get anywhere until the established people who aren't willing to look at new ideas die or step down. And it's unfortunate.
That's sad.
Yeah.
That same thing will happen in the future, too, to those people who are bringing in newer ideas.
Yes.
Eventually, they're going to be the ones holding out, too.
Unless we do something to fix it, and I don't see that happening. But I think,
human nature, I suppose.
If we're around as a civilization 50, 100 years from now, I think Graham Hancock will be vindicated. I think a lot, not all of it, but I think a lot of his stuff, people will be like, well, why didn't they listen to this guy? Look at this. They attacked him, and so on and so forth. And he was right. Why weren't they listening?
I think
I'd agree with that.
This should be like a cue to every flesh and blood Bigfoot guy who's going out in the woods in camo trying to find a monkey. The academics are going to look at you the same way that they look at Graham. There's not going to be, even if you find a body, I don't think you will, but even if you find a body, I don't think they're going to just change their minds. And if they do, you're not going to get credit for it. They'll take that and they will make that their own discovery. But, who are the guys looking for Bigfoot? They're regular guys, plumbers, construction workers. They're not going to get the credit that they think they're going to get by discovering Bigfoot.
Well, I think bring up Ivan Sanderson.
I think if you found a body, that might be one of the few ways. A body, or you had a living one, that might be one of the few ways you could change the establishment on an idea like Bigfoot.
And I don't know how valid this is, but it reminds me of Ivan T. Sanderson, who's kind of like the godfather of Bigfoot research.
Oh yeah.
And I was reading a story I guess it must have been back in the 60s or 70s when they supposedly found the corpse of a Bigfoot somebody had on display. And they had several leading experts in the field. They went out there and they did tests on it. And, they even named it a new kind of hominid. And they sent it for the Smithsonian and they were like, no, this is legit. And they sent like professionals, and then this corpse mysteriously vanished.
Yes. Yeah.
And, it's, and that is not the only time something like that's happened. And it becomes as time passes, a convenient way to saying, oh, well, yeah, it's probably just all a hoax or people were making it up, 30 years later. But at the time, you do have accredited people who do on occasion go and they look and it's like, no, this is legit. And then there's some mechanism or something happens later where it's gone.
It's also possible that those accredited people were wrong.
Of course it was. And that's something, again, myths of time, so to speak. But it is worth saying.
Missing evidence in Bigfoot all the time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about Graham's special that I was kind of surprised at is his easy dismissal of rumors of giants. And I
wanted to talk about the giants
because I'm looking at, and he keeps going, well, the giants, maybe they were giant in personality. And I'm like, why are you dismissing giants when you're here arguing for the veracity of these ancient accounts being exactly what they say they are? Yeah, but the giants part you're throwing out. And I'm thinking, is that where he's drawing the line? It's not so much whether he believes in that giants were here or not. I think he's afraid if he steps over that giant line, they're just going to use that to really go after him.
That's definitely what that is.
That's how I took
it. The giant, the idea of the giant, like this, ancient civilization of giants that inhabited the world, and it's one of the weirder, but I'd say most compelling parts of his theory. And then he throws it out. Because he's not the only one, because again, we were talking about this in the last time we gathered together on, obviously some of those stories of giants from history were probably hoaxes.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of ones that were not, bones and skeletons that have been uncovered over the last several hundred years, and historical accounts that, really do breach different cultures, like a lot of different cultures and civilization, hundreds of years ago and beyond, that do have these reoccurring, very established stories. And you have skeletons that have been unearthed, supposedly. Lots of stories of these skeletons. I was reading a story about even the Delaware Native Americans had, I believe it was, stories of giants in all over America.
Yeah. So I think that what's, he some of the stuff that he's been doing with Greg Little is actually, or at least it has, I think, from what I have heard, has influenced him into changing the way that he describes that, because at least in the way that most people are reacting to it right now, when you discuss the giants, it's assumed that you're saying that somehow the mounds and earthworks couldn't have been built by the indigenous peoples of America, and that it's coming from like a place of, racism and diminishing the native peoples. I've also heard that, I guess, Graham, as opposed to other places where he's been, is not like on great terms with some of the native people in like around Serpent Mound and stuff.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't not to go.
Well, that you're talking about. I'm talking actually about the like some of the tribes around there, which I believe were. Oh, okay. I'm totally forgetting. Shawnee, it might have been. I think in Ohio there, that he's like, they're not on good terms, and they're not into him too. So I don't know really what's going on with that, but I believe that the reason why he distanced himself is because of that perception. And I don't think that that's what he means. Neither do I think that that's what really, when anybody's looking into it. I mean, maybe some people are thinking it because people are always going to be racist. But I think that the idea of those giants was that it actually was an indigenous people of the Americas.
Well,
yeah.
You also have to, like, I'm sure people, when they hear giants nowadays, they think you're trying to confirm some sort of biblical reality.
Yeah.
Right. That was at least at one time very much a reason why, I think. And we've talked about that. You've talked about that before, Soraya.
Yeah.
Smithsonian, in terms of the Smithsonian stuff. Yeah.
But
and the same thing is true again. And I just wanted to mention this when people have brought up this sort of criticism when he discusses Quetzalcoatl and what is it, Viracocha. And the fact that, you know, he is no longer referring to this as, you know, as them as having white skin, which you notice he doesn't in the in Ancient Apocalypse, and that is again because he has been, you know, accused of being racist because he mentioned this in Fingerprints of the Gods, and that is because it's not his idea. This is stuff from you know, the Quetzalcoatl being white-skinned with red bushy beard. That comes from Torquemada's journals. The Viracocha being white-skinned with red bushy beard. That's like, you know, South American mythology from 1968 and, you know, all these other books there. So what he's drawing on is this, you know, these existing accounts. And, you know, you can call into question what those people were saying. Maybe they were being racist at the time and whatever, however many 100 years ago this was happening. It's quite possible because there's quite a bit of racism in anthropology. But that's why he has, you know, he's sort of veered away from that. But when you go back to the original source, it's not him making some sort of, you know, bloodline type of claim. He's simply reporting what happened, you know, or what was reported at the time. You know?
Yeah. You know, it's complicated. Like, you know, the idea that, you know, he's not the person creating these ideas, but they kind of come from an original source. And when you get into some of the original sources, it gets truly complicated. Have you guys heard about like the legends of the Moon-Eyed people from the Appalachians in like the West Virginia area?
I think so.
Mm-hmm. So this is actually an interesting example. And, you know, that's, you know, high strangeness circles. It's discussed a lot when we're talking about, you dig into like Mothman lore and everything like that. How, I think it was the Cherokee, I think, had the, you know, old legends of a pale-skinned, moon-eyed race of humans that were essentially described as, you know, white people with really pathetically big eyes that, you know, lived at night, and then they were eventually warred with them, and then they were driven off. And that they were described as white, like Caucasian-ish. But then if you go back into those legends, and I did some of the earlier the sources of these things, like this specific thing, it's suggested that they did have these legends, but the additional qualities of their white skin and some of the other ones were perhaps added by some of the colonials that interpreted for them or wrote their legends down, which had a more or less racist bent to them to kind of paint a picture or elaborate on these legends. And this is like in the 1800s. And things like that. But again, it's hard to say where you can draw those lines, or if that's a legend, I mean, or if somebody was, you know,
sure. No, that totally, that was very much a part of colonialism. And he could have, and one of the things I think that he might have very well learned is, since Fingerprints of the Gods, which was quite a while ago. And if you look back at like the 80s and 90s, which I remember living through, like it was, you might not have thought to question that if it was coming from a source, you know, and he might have changed his worldview, which is, you know, completely understandable too. And again, if we want to be realistic about it, we have to understand that race doesn't exist, and that what we're talking about here is we're talking about different people that have, you know, different cultures that are associated with different melanated skin types and, you know, hair colors that oftentimes are a result of where you were living and the climate you were living in. And that many of these cultures have adopted a sort of identity based upon these features, but there is no such thing as race.
Right. And a lot of times we're talking about it. We are discussing the works of, you know, people in the last 100 years and other scientists and writers and authors who were still, you know, knee deep in that assumed cultural attitude.
Yes.
You know, whether they meant it personally, if those people had meant it with a racist angle, but that was the world that
they didn't,
you know, the literary and academic world that they were writing, and it was just the foundation. They didn't even think to question it. And, you know, at the time they might even look at themselves as, you know, far from racist. It was the terminology and the mindset.
Sure. So, and I think that whatever, at least I have seen from Graham's from what is in Ancient Apocalypse and at least how he's attempting to, I don't think that he's discounting what the indigenous people are saying, and maybe he has in the past, but at least now he doesn't seem to be.
I don't think he ever really has. I mean, that's his whole point, is that we're not listening to these ancient cultures. Mm-hmm. Right. And like you'll hear that like people will research whether Vikings were here earlier or whatever, and it's like, oh, this is just racism, and it's like, well, if they were here, how is it racism? If there are genuine artifacts from 900 AD that the Vikings were here, how does that make that racism? Like, whatever happened is what happened, and that's part of the problem with Egyptology. Is that you have this cultural identity with, like, the pyramids and the Giza Plateau and all that. This is their pride of their culture. And you have someone like John Anthony West and Robert Schoch coming along saying, these were built a long time before the people who are there now were there.
But, that also doesn't mean that the ancestors or some of the ancestors of the people that came later weren't involved in it at that time either.
Yeah.
And I think it's the interesting focal point. I think people will focus on certain things that are important to be discussed, but they'll associate that importance in one context with the message trying to be given. And what I get out of Graham and a lot of these varied works is that you have patterns of circumstantial evidence to suggest through very similar archetypical folklore and legend, similar stories are being told about very specific certain events, like in ancient times, a heroic person arrived from outside that gave this post cataclysm ravaged civilization in one area lore from a parent or grandparent culture.
Right.
Which then, and I don't think that's racist. It just suggests that, if a culture's been disintegrated or they're trying to rebuild, you're getting knowledge passed on and then integrated, and those people are doing that work themselves too. So I think people should look at it that way as well. Like, it's not discounting any of these cultures. I think when people say, well, the Egyptians couldn't have built the pyramids because they didn't have it, so it was, aliens or whatever.
Right.
I can see how that can be disrespectful, and I see that point being made. But I think more the interesting idea is that, was there an influence in a very physical way of an ancient culture of some sort, or maybe multiple of them from a time we don't really have a lot of evidence from, influencing newer ones?
Yeah.
So that's it for me. Like, I think that's worthy enough to be interesting without discounting any of the works and legitimacy of the cultures and people themselves.
And I think Andrew Collins and Greg Little are looking at, is it the Solutreans or something like that? I can never say the name right, as being basically the giants, because they were 6 to 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
And at that time, the average, like Native American and such, and the average European was about 5 foot tall. So you had this other sub-race of humans who may have been the ones that had this knowledge and who were essentially giants, but not 10, 12 feet tall, just giants. If you're 5 foot tall, a 7 foot person is a giant. I don't know if you've ever stood next to, like like a wrestler or someone or a basketball player who's really tall, you're going, oh my God, you're like twice the size human I am.
Yeah, I saw Big Show in a match in Worcester, Massachusetts, back in the 90s when he was just starting out, and that, oh my God, it was like close too, because it was like an off. What's the name for it, Soraya, when it's off air?
Oh, a dark match.
Dark match. Yeah.
I mean,
God, he's so big.
Bubba Ray Dudley, when I met him, he was like standing next to a wall, and I'm just like, oh my God, I had no idea you were this big.
Yeah, last time we talked about how big was it Shaq's feet are?
Oh yeah,
his shoes being whatever 23 inches or something crazy.
I was thinking even Jared Padalecki, who's like Sam from Supernatural. Mm-hmm. Like my friend Amanda, she's a very tall woman. Like, she's like 6'3", and she's tall to me. And she did a photo. They went to one of like the Supernatural conventions, and she got a photo next to him, and she showed me, and he is like towers over her almost. Yeah. Like, she's like hugging. She gives him a hug, and she's like laying on his chest almost. and like how big some of these people are. And like a lot, we see him on TV and we don't really get it.
Yeah.
Because of the way they do, they call him like Moose in the show. And you're like, well, he's not that big. But then you see him in real life compared to other people, like people like him and Shaq, like they're really big. Like,
have you ever seen that video of them taking Ed Kemper into custody and him walking with the other officers?
No.
Oh, it's surreal because he's a huge man.
All right, well, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Check out wheredidtheroadgo.com. You will find an archive of every show, right back to the very first one that aired January 26, 2013. There's links to all of our social media, Discord, Facebook, the Facebook group, Twitter, YouTube. You can pick up merch at our store that is linked on the page. You can become a Patreon and get extra content every month for as little as $3 a month. You can leave a donation, go through blog entries, and you can contact us. If you have stories you'd like to share for a future Listener Stories episode, stories@wheredidtheroadgo.com is the place to send them. For general contact, it's contact@wheredidtheroadgo.com. And if you want to mail me something, you can do so at P.O. Box 444, Ovid, New York, 14521. I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons, because without you, this show would not be what it is. And I want to give a special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Chuck Shutters, Leanne Cherry, CJ, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Christine, a blue second gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Giaquinta, Alex Whitcomb, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Big Boy Lemona, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Christopher Ernst, Craig Cicernos, Billuminati, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., Empty K., Eric Todd, J., James Lattimore, James Lindsay, Jim Pyre, John Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linz Jackson K., Luke Osborne, MJ Armstrong, Jim and Sophie, Mark Brady, Matt in Delaware, Oli Andre Olar, Patricia W., Paul Jeffries, Philosopher of Mirrors, Ray Benedetto, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Stacy Sherwood, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Verosh K., Vincent Trewell, Walker, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Ren Collier, Stephen D., Amber Hall, and Craig Sagastumi. I thank all of you for the incredible support. And we're back on Where Did the Road Go? And I have with me, Octavian and Chris Ernst and Ian and Taylor.
Hey.
Hello.
And we're talking about Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse series that's on Netflix. And I highly recommend, especially if you're not overly familiar with Graham's work.
Yeah.
Watch the show before you read the articles.
Yeah. My wife watched it with me, and she, she's not, this is not her bag, but she's also one of the, I think most fairly minded people I know, and I'm biased, but I think she is, and she was really intrigued by it. She thought that it was it made an excellent sort of supposition as a journalist, not a scientific statement, but she thought it was a really interesting and plausible idea that was told in a sort of beautiful and fairly respectful way.
Yeah.
I told her this sort of controversy going on, and it was, the only bone she had to pick with is the same one that I had about Joe Rogan, but she was just like, I don't understand why. And she was like, really? She's like, I don't understand why they think this is racist or dangerous. That's
the other thing. Calling it dangerous, I don't get that. How is it dangerous to ask questions
or ask who allowed this show to exist? Like,
again, they're bringing it back again to this. I think understandable paranoia that exists about white supremacy and racism and the erasure of indigenous culture and colonialism. And there's a big reckoning that we have to have with that, but I don't think this is it,
I also think they're very afraid, there's this, I don't want to even call it an awakening, but this idea that experts shouldn't be experts, so that we don't need experts. I think that a lot of establishment is afraid that that's what this show is promoting.
Yes.
And I think that's a very big threat to them.
Yes. And,
well, I mean, they could have validity.
they
to
made
that
this
too,
monster.
but they did. And that's, I mean, we're in that time, but we've been talking about that for a while. I kind of wanted to bring up in the earlier part of the episode, but just even the first part of Ancient Apocalypse, or I don't want to butcher it. Is it Gunung Padang? The Indonesian site
close enough. Yeah.
Yeah. That was interesting because I did not know a lot of. What did you guys think about that? That whole site.
I've known about that site for a while. And again, even there, you're getting a pushback from the from the official archaeology acceptance there. That's like, oh no, this site is this old. And when they're pulling up things and carbon dating them to much older, and they want to look more into it, they're going, the government's going, no, I don't think that's going to happen,
And that's what frustrates me. And that happens a lot. Like they do that with, they did it in Egypt and they still are in a lot of these sites. And I'd say that, so far the biggest frustration, and it has been that is really highlighted, is it's just a simple human, like, well, why just look at it? Like, open it up. Why are you not, what is the stopping point? What is why are the official capacities not just looking at it and seeing what it is? And
a lot of times it has to do, at least in the experience that I had firsthand with I think a false version of this when I was out in outside of Sarajevo in Visoko near the quote-unquote Bosnian pyramids, which, the guy who founded those, Semiras Monagic, he is a charlatan. He can come after me if he wants for that. He's trying to make money, and he's not, it's quite possible that some of the stuff that was there could have been, earthworked. This is, again, we have these hills that look vaguely like pyramids, and then a culture that was there a long time ago sort of shaped them. I still think that's possible from looking at it. But, what the whole thing that Samir is saying is crazy. Anyway, from being there and talking to the officials and talking about sort of everything, even with very, very, there was enough sort of weird evidence that I think it possibly you might want to look into it. Some, LiDAR could have been great in doing some sort of scan or something like that. But it usually has to do with money and government corruption. At the end of the day. And unless you can figure out some way to, I can imagine that if there was some way for whoever owns that and the government property in Gunung Padang, or is that what it is?
I think so.
Yeah,
you're right.
That if they were able to do that, even they might not tell the rest of the world what's there unless it can, basically further money and power for the state.
True. And I think
that was very much the case too. Yeah, and that's very much the case in Egypt. I think it's the same thing.
Egypt's crazy about it.
It's interesting because we're all kind of in this sphere. Like, Soraya, didn't you say that the people who wrote The Invisible Gorilla didn't want to come on the show when you invited them?
No, I haven't invited them.
Oh, okay.
I said they may not want to because they are actual psychologists and they may not want to be associated with a show that deals with the paranormal and, stuff like that. But I haven't asked them, so I don't know.
Okay, I thought you had asked them, but
I just realized that could be a factor for them saying no, where they just don't want to be associated with something like this because it's not,
Yeah.
Yep. Reminds me of the case of Dr. X from Valet.
Oh yeah,
yeah. No, that really goes down to it. Is you do keep. It seems to be at the bottom of it is corruption and money, which is again it really sad when you think about it.
Well, it's also this also just reminded me of Graham Hancock when he was scheduled to speak with or debate the guy who got kicked out of Egypt. He was the antiquities minister forever.
Zahi Hawass?
Yes, no. Zahi.
Yeah.
And Zahi, I don't know if he just found out that day that Graham was going to be there or whatever, but he threw a temper tantrum and stormed out. And Graham's just we were just going to have a conversation. What's the problem?
He was calling them names, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Or something like that.
Is there a video of this?
Yes.
Oh, I'd like
It's
to
like
see.
you gotta say, like, what about this man threatens you so much
Well,
that
it's weird that they're not secure in their ideas. I mean, that's how it comes across in many
It
of the
does.
cases.
Definitely.
and it's like, if you have ideas, especially in science, that you should be able to stand on them on their own feet, and then you shouldn't have to even get truly emotional about it. Like if you have the evidence, it's pretty clear and it's backed up by research and work, then you say, here it is.
Right.
And
Right.
Well, I
I
think
think
also
in a lot of
you
these
should-
places, they're also, I think you do have to look at it again through the lens of colonialism, and that, science by and large is going to be, if it's money, it's going to be coming, unless it's coming from China at this point, it's coming from Europe or America. And a lot of these, countries were once, horribly ruled by America or, another European nation. And I think a lot of them just kind of want to, part of it at least, and I'm not saying all of it, is like, stay out of our business,
Oh, yes.
even if it's
And
just
that
a
is-
guy like Graham, who's,
Yep.
Who's from India.
That can be valid.
Yeah.
But, oh, is he?
Yeah, he grew up there at least. I don't know if he was
he grew up
initially
there.
from.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's fair. But, then at the same time, I'd like to hear, native scientists and professionals talk about it. Like,
I would too.
And they're
Yeah.
often marginalized. That's the thing.
Yes, that's
And
the
they
thing.
should not-
And they
then-
don't have the resources to do this.
Yeah.
They're just trying to sort of survive. So, and probably one of the ways to survive is unfortunately to become part of the larger international community that's more often than not governed by Europeans and Americans.
Yes.
And that's a third
Wait.
time this episode I'm going to say it. That's sad. And I think, I kind of feel like the energy of this episode is really focusing on how many, problems are in the establishment, going forward that, that need to be highlighted and fixed. So I think that
Yep.
whether if, people today and how they're going about it, in the public mainstream outlook, it's the right way, but I think hopefully it will, as time passes, move to have these colonial issues and all the issues that are were being highlighted, in the microcosm of Graham Hancock. And hopefully going forward, it gets better. So
Yeah,
we can
well-
just get down to the interesting parts of history and let people who, their lands that this stuff is on get to speak, from their own perspective, and then everybody gets an equal platform to do so.
You could try Graham's suggestion is to have all politicians try ayahuasca 12 times.
Yeah.
12 times.
Wait,
Oh
my God.
Or mushrooms. He said mushrooms would do too.
Yeah.
We're all gonna see the-
on Joe Rogan. Joe was like, why don't I get some of these official archaeologists to come on and debate you guys and have a real discussion? And Randall said, you'll never get them. They won't come. They'll say something like, we won't lower ourselves to Graham and Randall's position. And then the next thing I watch is an archaeologist basically crapping all over Graham. And he says, like, I'm not going to debate him. I'm not stooping down to that level. And it was just, oh, wow. Okay.
Really want to bring back Keel's type A, type B scientist thing. I think it's pretty relevant.
Or when
Well-
Soraya talks about the difference between a skeptic and a debunker.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also, the other thing is, as long as money runs the game, it's not going to change. Because, again,
Yep.
you study this stuff in college, you spend all this money for this degree, you then go out and get a job, and they're like, okay, your job isn't to reinvent the timeline. Your job is to just kind of
Support you,
solidify the timeline that already exists.
Yep.
And if you can't do that, you're going to lose your job. You could potentially
Yeah.
get blackballed. And again, part of that is a money thing.
It's your life.
Yeah.
So you can't even blame them in a lot of ways. Like, that is such a common, that whole trend is so common. It's like a cliche that's in movies and books. Like, the scientists who, they discover something and then their boss is like, you're just going to put this under the rug because you're not here to reinvent the wheel, as you
Right.
said. And it's like everybody knows that's how it works. And again, that's,
Well,
I guess
what
there's
we
not an
need
easy
in that
solution.
case-
Well, look.
Well, what we would need is, some billionaire maverick
Bob,
to come in here and start
Bigelow?
investing in other types of,
Unfortunately, all the billionaire mavericks that exist are like really terrible versions of Lex
Yeah.
Luthor.
yeah, that's true.
I mean, they did that with Skinwalker, kind of.
Yeah, but then they didn't really, then it comes out that some of it was a psyop and all this other nonsense. So,
Yeah.
but what was I just going to say? There was something else about, I lost
Yeah, we
it.
should talk about Graham more.
Oh, no, I was going to talk about Valet, because here you have a
Okay.
guy who's a astronomer and a computer programmer who's also investigating UFOs. But when he was doing early computer programming. If you read his forbidden journals, his forbidden science journals.
Yeah, I've read them.
There's the one point where he says to his boss, hey, I think I can make this computer. I think I can design something to search for words, not just like numbers. And his boss is like, that's not what you're here to do. And basically just blocks him for even trying to do, invent a search engine is what he was doing. All they could search for was numbers at the time. So he's like, I think I can do this with words. I think we can put in terms and search. Yeah. And the guy's like, no. And then he gets hired by someone else who goes, oh, absolutely, go for it. And that's, one of the first search engines.
Yeah. And that's how Vallée got started in a different way too, where he was an astronomer, or he was, I don't know if he was an astronomer, but he was at
he was an
observatory. Yeah, he was an astronomer. And then he noticed that they had picked up these anomalous objects, and then everybody at that telescope were like, throw it out.
Yeah.
And he's like, why? Yep. And he's like, throw it out. It's ridiculous. And he never got a word. And he's like, but you're scientists. And it goes right down to the core of it. Like,
what they told him,
scientists.
What they told him is that if France came out and said they had, they had tracked a UFO, they would be the laughing stock.
Exactly.
So until
they wanted to keep their careers and a good name, and
until like the U.S. or someone came out first where it would be accepted, they just destroy it.
And that's fourth time. Sad, but it's very similar in that idea that you have people who dedicate their lives to uncovering mysteries, who are terrified of losing their livelihood to actually talk about them.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, I guarantee that, at least in part, that is why at least some of us are in the business, so to speak. Like, that's unacceptable to me. And like, you got to give it to people like Jacques Vallée and Graham Hancock, who are like, you know what? I'm going to keep doing it, whether I'm right or wrong.
They have, both of those guys come from money to some degree, and that gives them a little bit of a privilege. I wish everybody could do that.
Yeah.
True. Again, it goes back to money, but those are, I guess, the realities of how it is now. But I guess we could talk a little bit more about, the ideas posited himself.
We're almost out of time, so we'll have to do that on a Patreon segment.
We can. All right.
But did Vallée come from money, or did Vallée just make money doing computer programming?
I think it was that one. I think Graham Hancock kind of came maybe from it.
No, Vallée made money. Yeah. Venture capital.
Because he's a really smart, talented guy, and he was smart enough to say, you know what? We're gonna, Vallée made money, and I would say he probably earned the money he made. He's a fiction author too. He's a smart dude.
I will still never get over that one tweet where he was at some conference, and they're listing off all these people, and they just labeled him as
UFO enthusiast.
Yes, exactly. UFO enthusiast. It's like, what?
Yeah.
And that's funny. He's the type of guy you probably like from different aspects of life that he's involved in. You probably have people who think of him as like the internet guy, and then you have the other people who think as a UFO guy who haven't researched him heavily. But because I guess he's a pretty big deal in certain tech circles too.
Yes, he is.
And we should do. If you guys ever want to do a show about some of Vallée's stuff, I would love to be a part of it. Like, I was thinking about that. You guys hear of his theory of Dr. X, as he called it, from Dimensions and some of his other work? He talks about the French doctor.
Yeah.
Back when he was younger, who saw those two UFOs.
That's one of my favorite cases that he puts in Dimensions.
Oh, same. I don't know. Have you done a show on that one already?
No.
Well, we should talk, because I'd love to explore and talk about that one sometime.
Well, we could talk a little more about this in the Patreon segment, but for now, where can people find each of you? Let's start with Chris.
You can find me here, or brightrectangle.com, or films are on Troma now, and Amazon Prime Video at this point.
And the two films are?
Corpse and The Hill in the Hole. That's it.
And let's go to Octavian.
You can find Ian and I at strangedominionspodcast.com, or on Strange Dominions on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and now Mastodon.
Mastodon, okay. I just heard about Mastodon.
I haven't posted anything yet. I just started it like a few days ago.
There's Mastodon and there's Hive that have both popped up recently.
Yeah, it's funny that he said he had made a Mastodon account, and I read that, or I don't know if you told me, but I had made an account a few hours before him, and I had no idea what Mastodon was. Like somebody I was following had made it, and I just clicked. And I was like, yeah, why not? And I did it, and then he was like, oh, I made a Mastodon account. I was like, weird.
I mean, someone mentioned Mastodon, and I went, the band? What?
Yeah, right.
Brent Hines, what?
So Ian, is there anywhere else that you can be found that he has not already mentioned?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook on just under Ian Burton, Twice Great, one word. And you can email me. Honestly, I put my email a lot out on Reddit and things for people to send me their personal accounts of high strangeness and weird. And that's just, it's nixian.hollow@outlook.com, NYXIAN _hollow@outlook.com. So any listeners got some weird stories of your own, we're always looking for them for Strange Dominions.
Cool. And we're always looking for them for this show too. So.
Oh yeah, we all need. We want to hear.
And Taylor.
Green Lion Podcast, and also Sigil Arcanum Tarot.
All right. Thank you all. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
We do continue this conversation in a Patreon-only segment, and also get another weird story from Octavian and Ian about something that happened to them recently, which was pretty interesting. So, again, check out Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix, Graham Hancock's new series. And if you want to become a patron and help us out, it's only $3 a month. You can do so at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Just click on the big Patreon link. You can also donate there, find all our social media shows all the way back to the beginning, everything. And all the Patreon content is, of course, available on Patreon all the way back to the beginning of that, too, in like 2015 maybe, or 2014, something like that. I know we picked it up on it pretty early on Patreon's existence. And I will see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.